Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the webinar, Strategizing for 2026 and Beyond, Part 2, Innovation, Projects, Investments, and Activities. My name is Naveen Krishnamurthy. I bear the privilege and the scrutiny that comes with working with Chief Technology and Innovation Officers among our clientele. So it pleases me to say that the bulk of today's presentation will be conducted by my colleague, Lux's Chief Product Officer, Ari Van Berkeley. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com. That's questions@luxresearchinc.com. And we'll respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check your internet connection. With that, Ari, the title of this webinar is intriguing. Did today's audience miss a part 1 to Strategizing for 2026 and beyond?
I hope they didn't. So hopefully we'll be among a lot of familiar faces here. And there's so many I haven't had a chance to check, and I didn't memorize exactly who attended part 1, but there was a part 1. And it will become clear why there is a part 1 and what part 1 was about and how it links to this part 2. But don't worry, if you did miss part 1, you can still watch it afterwards. But also you will find that you could still follow part 2 perfectly well, even if you miss part 1. Although I would still recommend also watch part 1 if you haven't. So thank you for the kind introduction, Naveen, and let's just get right into it. Our agenda for today is quite simple. We're going to talk about strategizing for near-term wins. And then specifically within strategizing, we are going to talk about how to get organized and how to measure if you're actually doing what you set out to do. And then we'll give you, just like we did in part 1, a recipe for how to get started on this. So for those of you who watched part 1, I'll be a bit quicker about this. This is kind of a repetition of the introduction we used for part 1 around strategizing. And really, I want to emphasize why you need to take a strategic approach to innovation. And hopefully I don't have to convince you anymore, but more importantly, what that strategic approach would look like. And we have a particular approach developed at Lux throughout our experience of working with so many different innovation organizations in so many places in the value chain. So we live in interesting times, which may or may not be a blessing, but one of the interesting things is when you look at R&D intensity, and this is an index that we created across many different companies in the industrials, OEMs, chemicals, and CPG industry. You can see that there is a trend and a divergence in R&D intensity. And what's happening, what's going on there? If you look behind the numbers, you can see that industrials have to increase R&D intensity. Why is that? There's an ever faster product cycle. So new products need to be released quicker than before. And industrials cannot afford to ignore any one of their products. If you sell 10 pieces of equipment, 10 different pieces of equipment as an industrial company, you have to create an update, a new version of it every so many years, depending on which industry you're in. Could be 2 years, all the way up to maybe 6 years, but not much longer than that nowadays. And so you have to innovate across your entire portfolio. And that's why we see this increase in R&D intensity since the start of this century. Chemicals and CPG is slightly different. There you have to target. So you have a big product portfolio, but you don't have to innovate across your entire product portfolio. Some of these products that you have are staples, and they're just gonna remain the same. So if one of your products might be polyurethane, and most of your polyurethane is going to be just the same polyurethane for the next 10 years. But there might be some place in your polyurethane product portfolio where you want to innovate because you want to encapsulate phase change materials, perhaps, or something like that. So with chemicals and CPG, it looks like R&D intensity is going down, and in fact it is across the entire portfolio. But they are getting much more targeted. In both cases, you have to have a really good strategy. You have to be much more precise than before about where you innovate and why. And that's what we're talking about today. If you want to be strategic and you want to create a strategy, then it helps if you know what a strategy is. And so if you look it up in the Cambridge Dictionary, you can see that a strategy is the way in which a business, government, or other organization carefully plans its actions over a period of time to improve its position and achieve what it wants. So a strategy is a plan because it's the result of careful planning. It should contain actions. So it's a plan, but it's also action-oriented. It has a timing to it, and it has two outcomes: a change in position and a concrete achievable goal. So if you want to make a strategy, your to-do list is to set the timing, to define what change in position you want to achieve. And let me give a change in position is typically that you are more capable of doing something that you were not very capable of doing before executing your strategy. So maybe the change in position is that you were not really in a good position to sell to food ingredients clients, but at the end of your strategy, you are very capable and in a good position to sell to food ingredients clients, which is something that DSM did, for example. You have to then make a plan, define your actions, and I would say you have to repeat. The strategy needs to be updated, needs to be changed, needs to be modified based on your own success, but also based on changing external conditions. And like I said, at Lux, we have developed a way that, in our experience, works really well across the board with many different organizations that we work with in many different places in the industrial value chain. And this is our system. This is our wheel of strategy, where you start with the why, and you base the why defines what position you want to obtain, and you can do that based on weak signals. And this is the infamous part 1 that we discussed earlier. If you want to know more about weak signals and about how to define your positioning, look at part 1. Once you know that, you have to make a plan. And the plan is about setting goals. And once you have set goals, defining what kind of projects you need to define, or what kind of activities you need to define to achieve those goals. Our methodology for that is a very elaborated, specific road mapping methodology. And we actually also had a webinar on that. It was called Why You Need to Stop Making Technology Roadmaps. Which didn't mean you had to stop making roadmaps, but just don't make them about technology, make them about achieving your business goals. And you can watch that. If you missed it, you can find it and you can watch that. Once you've defined what you need to do, you need to start doing it. And that's what we are going to talk about today. So today is about defining how you organize to execute on your roadmap, and then also how you measure if you are actually successful in executing your roadmap. That's today's topic. And when talking about that topic, and when talking about organizing, we are not going to talk about whether you need to change the name of a department, or whether you need to add a department or something like that. What we're talking about is how you are going to create the balance between obtaining leverage, meaning you don't innovate alone, you innovate together with others and you share the risk of the innovation with others, versus control, meaning you dictate what's going to happen, you own the results of this, you have complete control over what you are going to do. And excellence, meaning you work with the best. This is as you can see, we put it in a triangle here because there's a tension between these and you need to compromise between all of these three angles. If you don't care too much about control, but you want to balance between leverage and excellence, that could be very good. And we'll talk about that in a moment, because you'll get best-in-class solutions. But maybe the price you have to pay for it is you don't have so much control. You could also say, well, I will pay for it. I'm rich. I'll pay for everything myself. Right? I don't care too much about leverage. It's just all on me. I'm taking all the risk of the innovation, and it will allow you to balance between control and excellence. And you can own the best-in-class solutions all by yourself and have complete control over commercialization. But it will be expensive. Or you can say, well, I want to build a great consortium with the people I like to work with, and maybe they're not always the best in class globally, but my consortium will be the best because it's the best group of partners that I can assemble. So now you're balancing between control and leverage, but you're maybe compromising on excellence. And obviously, there are all sorts of in-betweens, and we'll be talking about that. So let's get a bit more into this. How do you organize? How do we move from what to how to execute? How do we organize and how do we measure? Well, let's go back to this cycle. Right now, supposing you followed this entire strategy cycle, right now, you've gone through the why, the planning, and the what stages. And so what you have by now is you have a good vision of what success looks like. You know what your position is. You know what it looks like when you achieve that position. And preferably you have visualized it in some way. You have a good set of targets to be achieved. Targets could be something like, I want to decrease the cost of manufacturing something by 20%, or I want to improve the performance of my product by so and so much. You've consulted with all of your experts and they've given you ideas. You have a list of projects or activities that you would like to develop. So you've got all of that in place, and the task ahead now is, how do I get this going? I know what projects I want to do. I know what activities I want to do. How do I do this in the best possible way? So one choice is to not have too much control, but balance between excellence and leverage. And a good example here is the Holst Center, which is a shared innovation program organized by IMEC from Belgium and TNO from the Netherlands. And it's inviting parties to collaborate on the production of polymeric electronics. Now, so these parties are joining forces to develop something, so they don't have ultimate control over what's developed. They have a measure of control if they, to a certain extent, own it, but they are also sharing it with everyone else. Why are they doing that? Because this kind of development requires a completely new value chain to be developed. None of the participants in the whole center could achieve the kind of excellence they're achieving today on its own. They need that integration across the value chain of the innovation activities, not even integration of production, integration of invention. So they're all relinquishing control in order to have excellence, but also in order to de-risk the developments and have some leverage. So they're also sharing the risk of creating these innovations. So this is one good example of where you would happily or should happily be less worried about controlling these innovations, but really focus on leverage and excellence. By the way, companies that do this will usually pull these developments out of the whole center once they reach TRL 6 or 7. And the final stretch of development where they really productize these things will be done in-house. So they'll be seizing back control, if you like, at a certain stage of development. You can also say, I don't want to focus so much on leverage. I really want ultimate control, and I want to be excellent. So I want the best possible product that I completely control. And a good example of that is ARM. And you can see their campus here in Snow, which is actually quite rare nowadays. They focus on excellence in one area, really efficient computing power. And that resulted in an IP position where we now are looking at a company that has a market capitalization of around 150 billion without owning a single production asset. This is a pure licensing business, licensing and development business, obviously, worth 150 billion. Essentially without much collateral. The only collateral is well, this office and the beautiful snow around it, and of course, the IP. Finally, the final part of the triangle, you can say, well, control and leverage are my priorities, and excellence is deprioritized, which doesn't mean, let me be clear about that, that what's happening in this kind of situation is not excellent. It means that you prioritize building a good group, a good consortium to work with, which of course will contain excellent parties, but will also sometimes be a compromise between people that you can work with really well and people who are the best at what they do. And a good example here is the Toyota Carrechu, which is one example of a OEM leading a group of their suppliers into innovating. And those suppliers are allowed to supply to other companies as well. But by leading them and by assisting them in the innovation and sharing the innovation risk, Toyota makes sure that the innovations are benefiting primarily their roadmap. And yes, they're also benefiting, no doubt, other car companies, because some of those innovations will end up in the cars of other companies. But that's maybe a little bit important, but not really that important, because Toyota has control over where the innovations are prioritized and how they fit in their system. And this is a very good example of where you have control and leverage. Another good example that I considered adding here was ASML. ASML is making these insanely complicated EUV machineries for microchip manufacturing. And they have a whole ecosystem of suppliers like Zeiss for the optics, for example, who are co-innovating with them. And no doubt also providing some of the spin-off of the innovation to other clients. But by giving them the most challenging, the most daring innovation challenge and supporting it and making sure that everyone knows that once they succeed in the innovation, ASML will actually buy it. They promote innovation, they create leverage, shared risk in the innovation, which speeds up their innovation and gives them a measure of control. So having looked at these examples, where does it leave you? Well, you have a lot of tools nowadays. Compared to your peers, your predecessors, 25 years ago, or maybe by now 35 years ago, when people started talking about open innovation, Right now, you have a lot of innovation tools. You can collaborate with universities. You can go into a shared innovation program like the Host Center. You can organize innovation challenges or hackathons. Those are not the same, but they're similar. You can do tech scouting. You can become a launching customer for innovations. So you call a supplier, you say, if only you were to develop this thing, I would buy it from you. And that could be enough stimulus for your supplier, or maybe even for a prospective supplier who's not yet even your supplier today, to start developing this, as long as you're guaranteed that you would buy it. You can be an integrator. Well, you can see all the options here, and your task ahead is to really map your tools into this area where you compromise between control, leverage, and excellence. And then, of course, when you do, make the right choices for all the actions that you defined. So having said that, this is tricky to do. This is not easy to do. And so it's probably inevitable that you're going to make some choices that you later regret. And that brings us to another important point. And when you remember that strategy process, that wheel that we showed you, one part is your organizational design, which is making these choices. The other part, and that's something that I'd like to hand over to my colleague Naveen here, who is going to take you through some considerations on creating that balanced scorecard, where the emphasis, I think, should be on balanced, but also a little bit on scorecard.
Indeed, Ari. Yes. So far, what we've done is we've just finished talking about plans to actions. Now, how do you go from actions to excellence and maintain that state of excellence? Is there a way to measure, track, and hold ourselves accountable? And this is where we get into the discussion on balanced scorecard. A balanced scorecard is not about having to make existential decisions across all of the competing priorities and interests that management face. That's for a future discussion. And it's not about prioritizing from among many strategic innovation priorities. You've already done that by now in this process. And it's certainly not about ensuring work-life balance for employees, although that might be a nice outcome as well. In fact, a balanced scorecard is simply a means to measure what it takes to get from here to there. Measuring, tracking, improving. Metrics, thresholds. So if we were to start with the end in mind, the profit motive seems to be a good way to begin. To deliver against the right profit metrics, what are the right metrics to evaluate the value of our company's offerings to customers, the profit? And to achieve those thresholds, those metrics for customers, what are the right metrics for processes within our company? And how do we measure the element of talent and workforce that drives those processes? Get into this one by one. First, in the profit pillar, what is the size of the prize? Both the revenue potential as well as the potential margin capture for our company. What will keep us from attaining that potential? How much should we invest in innovation to address both the hurdles and the opportunity? And why is innovation the best route? And yes, what does one ounce of innovation yield in terms of rewards that accrue to our company? That's all great. What's in it for the market? That gets us to pillar number 2, proffer. What does our innovation portfolio really do for existing and prospective customers? Do we create wins for ourselves as well as our partners in ways that our competition, cannot emulate? And how well do we manage vocal stakeholders? That's proffer. And then there's a few items specific to the actual doing. That's process. In pillar 3, think of this almost like optimizing an engineering workflow. The quality and volume of best fit ideas coming in inputs? How many of those reach the market successfully alongside our existing offerings, outputs? And how well do we manage resources, time, tools, and yes, data to make decisions effectively? And of course, what about talent? That's increasingly a diminishing resource. That gets us to pillar number 4. In this multi-generational workforce where baby boomers have not yet fully departed, and we're given to believe that at least some Gen Z still want to show up for work, there is a vast difference in the nature and intensity of lived experience. And management's ability to congeal these 3 things, these 3 important things: employees' competence, employees' energy, and employees' interest, to congeal these three things toward performance is critical. And yes, making the place a talent factory so that good becomes great. That is to say, across these 4 pillars, really, we started with profit, yes, but what is really happening is people drive process, process drives commercial outcomes drive our company's profit. There you have it. And yes, we agree, easier said than done. So let's take a look at a couple examples. Start with SBM Offshore. This is a $6 billion revenue company in the Netherlands, involved in offshore oil and gas exploration, production, and FPSOs. In its 2024 annual report, the company discloses a few numbers that give us a view into the types of things related to their balanced scorecard that they are confident enough to share with the world. In fact, here's how the company's management board is incentivized as part of their compensation package. Nothing out of the ordinary so far. The company, in fact, goes one step further. It discloses what makes up profitability and growth from a management board compensation perspective. This is what it looks like. It's an eye chart, but now you get to see some of these performance indicators that we can surmise exist here in their annual report because the company is confident that they have a way to not only measure these things, but also tie these indicators intimately to the company's performance enough to be able to incentivize management to improve those things continually. Things like project execution, performance, progress on growing areas like near zero FPSO development. Again, a performance indicator. Operational excellence. And of course, safety and employee engagement as part of the people pillar that we just discussed so far. Again, profit, proffer, process, and people. That's just one example. And I think, Ari, you may have a broader example, correct?
Yeah, an example and a suggestion. So, and I know there's always a lot of criticism about the EU, about how it's sluggish and perhaps bureaucratic, and that's all true. But the EU also has by now about 30 years of experience of comparing apples and oranges in executing their framework programs, the big innovation programs in the EU. And that has been ever evolving. So this is a journey of also inventing how to manage a big program like that, and more importantly, how to turn it into economic impact. The EU is not a company, so it's not directly applicable to a company. But if you're looking for a good checklist for creating your own balanced scorecard, I highly recommend you look at the evaluation framework. They call it the evidence framework that the EU has developed for Horizon Europe. And it goes into scientific impact, societal impact, economic and technological impact, and optimized program delivery. So it looks at all aspects of impact, but also on whether you're doing a good job of executing. I won't go into this. Maybe we should perhaps consider having a webinar specifically on this and discussing this for you, but that's for another day. But just if you're looking for a good inspiration, a good way of looking of building your own balanced scorecard, I think this is highly inspirational and built on 30 years of experience of comparing projects that are completely different in industry they're targeting, in the nature of the development, but still metrics that are meaningful for all of those different projects. So on to our final part of today's webinar. And this is really about how you get going. So what can you do now that you've seen all of this? And we're looking at how can you get started on your organizational design and developing your balanced scorecard. Now, first, organizational design. What do we do when you're looking at this triangle and figuring out what's the best way to do all of these actions? Should you do it in-house R&D? Should you establish a corporate venture capital arm? Should you become an LP in a venture capital fund? What is the best way to get started? We look at your entire ecosystem. So we look at your existing assets, we look at your supply chain, the research ecosystem that you're part of, the regulatory and financial environment, and last but not least, the societal paradigms that you can access. So are you in an environment that is really supportive of climate measures, or are you in an environment that is not supportive, or do you have a choice where you want to be in terms of environment for this development? We map your entire ecosystem, and that helps us to make those choices. What are the risks that you need to de-risk? What are your potential partnerships? Do you have any potential partnerships? If you don't, maybe it's better to do it by your own. What are the dependencies that you have to deal with? And based on that, we can help you make choices within that triangle of excellence, leverage, and control. So it's highly situational dependent, and we map out your situation first, and then we help you pick the right tools for each of your actions. So that's dreaming to doing, but you also have to get back. So you have to get back from doing to dreaming again. And that's about the balanced scorecard. And really, the balanced scorecard eventually, and that's also about the design of your balanced scorecard, you need to be able to bring it back to two things: alignment and execution. So how well are you executing? Are you doing things right? And then also, how well are you aligned to the goals? And aligned to what? To that positioning and those goals that you determined previously. So are you doing the right things? Of course, you think when you start that you're doing the right things. That's why you're doing them, but things may change. And then you can probably dissect your entire portfolio into 4 parts. You can say, well, I'm not really doing things right, and I'm also not doing the right things. So those projects you should cancel, and that's actually quite hard to do. And that's where we get many questions by clients. How do we stop projects? Help! I'm having projects. I don't know how to stop this thing. A balanced scorecard is really important because it allows you to explain and get support throughout your organization to also stop activities, because it makes it painfully evident to people that you should stop it. If it turns out you're doing things really right, things are going really well, but you're unsure if you're still heading in the right direction, you need to go back to the drawing board. You need to adjust your goals or still stop those projects. If you think they're the right things to do, and that's the upper left quadrant, if you think you're doing the right things, but you're not getting anywhere, the execution is not going as you would like it to go, then go back to the triangle and reconsider your organizational design. Are there other ways you could achieve this? And of course, if you're doing the right things and you're doing them right, have a party. Maybe invest a bit more in that direction. And recognize those successes as well. So that brings us to our key takeaways for today. A really important one to realize is that innovation is not about scientific supremacy anymore. And because that's still an undercurrent in innovation. As long as I have the right science, as long as I'm really good at inventing things, I'm fine. And that is the origin. That's where corporate R&D labs existed and all that. But nowadays, excellent science is so abundant that it's not enough of a protection anymore. Anyone can access excellent science now if you have the means, if you have the good idea, if you have some investors. So you should still have access to excellent science, but it's not enough. Instead, you need to leverage your partnerships. So it's about having excellent friends, if you like. And that's a real asset of your company. That means that you need to develop it, and developing the network is a lot of work. It's an investment. So once you have developed it, you need to hang on to it. It is as important an asset as your manufacturing assets. Or if you're ARM, it may even be your only asset. And you can be worth 160, 150 billion dollars based on it. And then avoid simple metrics. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have simple metrics, but avoid simplicity for the sake of simplicity. Ensure that you have a balanced framework. So your capital asset investments, of course, must have a sound investment thesis and must have a good return on investment and all that. Innovation projects should have the same, but they will never have just only a business case. Because at the end of an innovation project, you still have to do the investment in actually launching and producing the product. So the innovation project has one job to do, which is to create the opportunity for you to invest in the cash flow afterwards. But it probably has more jobs to do as well, like building your network, building your skills, securing license to operate. So you have to consider all of these aspects in order to really know if your portfolio is delivering for you. With that, Naveen, I'll hand it back to you. I suppose you have been monitoring our Q&A channel.
Indeed.
Yeah, let's see what's happening over there.
Let's do it. Thank you, Ari. That was a great presentation. We'll now be taking questions that the audience may have on this presentation, which you can type into the questions box. And if we do not get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch with you after this webinar. Here's a question, Ari. Should the mapping of tools triangle, it brings to mind a phase diagram, be performed for each major business division within a large enterprise? Think about an integrated oil and gas company, Ari, or a very large specialty chemical company. How do you pick those divisions within which to conduct this type of exercise as opposed to doing it for the entire enterprise?
Yeah, so it must be someone that hasn't watched part one of this webinar, I think. So it's a valid question, make no mistake. But the point is, you already have made that decision previously when you made the roadmap. So the answer is, you should do this mapping for every action that you identified on the roadmap. Now, the roadmap, you may have decided to create a roadmap per business unit or per business division. In most cases, I would doubt that that's the right choice. It's better to look at each opportunity that you want to pursue, each change in position. I want to enter that market. I want to increase my market share in this market. I want to change my product to be much more impactful in this market. Those are the kind of lines, if you like, those are the kind of items that you put on your roadmap, or those are the roadmaps that you create. You may want to create like 3 or 4 different roadmaps for 3 or 4 different business objectives. And depending on who you are as a company, it may make a lot of sense to tie those business objectives to a division or a business unit, or it may make a lot more sense to have those roadmaps across business divisions, or even separate as perhaps a new business unit. As an example of that, and like ExxonMobil is creating its low carbon business division, which is essentially a completely new branch of their business, which relies heavily on all of their existing competences and assets. Now, Now that you've asked me a question, Naveen, I'm just also looking through the Q&A, and I think it's good to also take a look at some of the questions around metrics. And there's one here that stood out to me, which is about, it's great that you have identified metrics. And I think that's a valid question. But then how do you assign norms or values to those metrics? How do you know what is a good number to achieve in any one of those items on your scorecard?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So somebody who's clearly grappling with how to develop productivity or outcomes or even the inputs that go into some of these balanced scorecards. This is really the conversation we've been having with quite a few CTOs and CIOs. It seems to be converging, especially this year, as we continually look for why innovation. I would say crawl, walk, and then run. So crawl, walk, then run. What we presented today is not a comprehensive set of elements, 4 elements within each pillar. You know, what we have to do is to make the balanced scorecard your own. And you do that by understanding what are some critical elements within your organization that most need balancing. And not from one year to the other, but across business cycles. And if the data is available, make sure that you look historically and devise the right thresholds for those metrics, for those elements within the pillars, and make sure that you're giving yourself some stretch goals within those metrics, not just reach goals. Reach goals are things you can achieve with a little bit of effort. Stretch goals, you're going to have to assert yourself to make sure that you actually achieve those. That's a good way to think about the right metrics. The key to doing this is to remember that in developing thresholds, metrics, criteria, we often forget things like people and the value for customers. We tend to get too bogged down on the process. What we're sharing is that there's 4 equally important pillars: people, process, proffer, and then profit. What's in it for your customer's customer to remain loyal to your customer, for example? And lastly, I'll say this exercise is also valuable another way. As you choose each metric, each threshold, you'll also determine the relative balance between those 4 pillars themselves as well. And Ari, with that, I'm cognizant of time. I'd love to have this banter go on for longer, but I would say that this concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all the attendees via email today. I want to thank you, Ari, in particular. And for the audience, after leaving this webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. Take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.